We're now at the most anticipated part here. We're pretty excited this morning to have Erica here. She's hiding in the corner, but she's going to come up. So Erica Violet Lee is a Two-Spirit Nahia writer and community organizer from West Side, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in the land currently referred to as Canada. She has a BA in political theory from the University of Saskatchewan and is now a graduate student at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto, pursuing her master's degree in the Department of Social Justice Education with a focus on Indigenous feminist freedom and embodied sovereignties situated in the prairies. So if you weren't already excited for the keynote, that should help you out. She's co-editing 2 forthcoming anthologies from the University of Manitoba Press, and she writes about navigating academia as a young Native woman on her blog moontimewarrior.com. Erica's keynote this morning is called Rebellious Love, Indigenous Freedoms, Histories, and Futures on the Prairies. So if you could join me in welcoming Erica.
Tanse? Can everyone hear me? I have like 6 microphones on, so I hope you can hear me. Should be able to, it should work. Okay, so I have these. Oh, perfect. Okay. Tanse, Erica Violet Lina, Tikasan, Misaskotomanik, Egwa PSAO Wasis, Toronto, and Nia Oma Nehio. Ani Nadishnikaz, Erica Nadunjaba, Misaskotomanik, Miniwa, PSAO Wasis, Dish with 1 spoon, and My name is Erica, I'm Nehio, and my family is from Thunderchild First Nation, as well as various places across the land. I'm happy to be here in Treaty 4 lands. I want to start by thanking the workers, servers, those who prepared food, those who build, clean, and maintain this university, its buildings and its classrooms, without whom we could not be here. I want to thank the folks at UR Stars. UR Stars is the correct way to say it? Okay, UR Stars. We have stars back at USask. University of Regina Stars, particularly Kadia and Mike, for bringing me home for the week and offering me fair compensation for my work. Here we arrive at one of the key points I want you to take home. Indigenous folks, including students, elders, and community people, are deserving of fair monetary compensation for their labor and expertise. In the pursuit of indigenization, the burden of educating is often placed on Indigenous folks, and we're labeled as hostile if we assert our sovereignty over our knowledge and our bodies by saying we deserve to be paid. Quite simply, in the words of Leslie Spillett, some of you might know her, she runs Kani Ganachik in Winnipeg, and she is Tasha Spillett's mom. Tobacco offerings alone don't pay the rent. When Canadians think of the prairies, okay, so I just want to do one more check, audio check. Can everyone in the back hear me? I'll try my best, okay. If I'm at any point I'm a little quiet, please feel free to put up your hand and wave it or something. It's important to me that everyone can hear. When Canadians think of the prairies, they imagine a mixture of snow, nothing, and extractable resources. In Candide, Voltaire famously characterized Canada as quelques arpents de neige, a few acres of snow, mocking France's intensive efforts to colonize what he saw as a valueless, barren land. Growing up, I remember detesting the long, freezing prairie winters, but now I understand the necessity of winter for these lands, and in the context of climate change, how our long, cold winters are an integral part of our resistance to colonialism and our relationships. Winter is a time to renew relationships in Nahio traditions. And it's a perfect time to talk about the winter today because it's freezing cold out, and Tennille and I slipped many times while trying to come here, but we didn't fall. Thank you, Creator. So I think about this term, some of you might know, I just want to get a feel of the audience. A lot of folks are teacher candidates, right? Like you're learning to be educators. Is that a lot of you? Put up your hands. Okay, perfect. And most of you, I believe, have not done your practicum in classroom practicums yet, so your pre-service hands. Okay. So I think about the idea of terra nullius a lot, and terra nullius is one of the first ideas I learned in high school from one of my favorite teachers, and a teacher that like I'm continue to be friends with today, Sheila McLean, Dr. Sheila McLean now at the University of Saskatchewan. I went to her defense, and that was the first time I ever saw a dissertation defense, and it was really beautiful and emotional to see her having been part of the work that she's done for so long get to that point. And she taught me the term terra nullius when I was very young, so like in high school. And I see a lot of debates happening now. How young is too young to start telling kids in Canada about residential schools? How young is too young to start talking about colonialism? And the reality is it's not, like, I don't think it's ever too young. And having been around Indigenous women and caregivers who raise their children, teaching them and immediately disrupting sort of the bad things that come up, the colonial notions and racist notions that they learn at school. Even it's something like as simple as Thanksgiving, we see this a lot, the making the little teepees and Indians and pilgrims and stuff. So the term terra nullius resonates through my work because, does anyone know what terra nullius means? Nobody home, Marjorie! Marjorie Bocage is one of my favorite people in this place. Yeah, nobody home, she said, which is a very kind way of saying land that is not being used, land that is empty, land that is unoccupied. It's just like there for the taking. So if you read old Canadian history texts, or even new Canadian history texts, you'll often run into this idea of terra nullius, that nothing happened. Either nothing happened on the land before settlers came, or we just warred all the time. And I ran into this the other day talking to a political studies professor. He said, well, you guys just like were at war all the time before settlers came. And I was like, that's terra nullius. Thanks, Sheila, for teaching me that term. I think a way of extending that idea is the idea of terra extractus. And I think of that in terms of the prairies quite often, in Saskatchewan, even Saskatoon, inner city Saskatoon where I'm from. Terra extractus. I'm from lands that have been deemed discovered, drained of their worth and resources, or filled with poison, and then left empty, turned into wastelands. Rarely are these brownfields professionally reclaimed, rarely maintained, and so they often become some of the rare spaces of unchecked plant growth. All this amidst the paved to death, sterilized environment of the inner city. There are still medicines that grow here. So this is the city where I'm from. This is the train tracks that run through the city. These are old train tracks, and they run straight through the heart of the city, is another term for inner city, the west side, the hood, as it's often referred to. And right in the corner here, you see Station 20 West. And Station 20 West was a community initiative, a community service center where there's a lot of community services. There's the University of Saskatchewan that has an outreach office there. There's CHAP, which runs a good food program. They deliver a good food box because there's no grocery stores in our community. And there was a grocery store as well that was hard fought for, but eventually, because of the Bradwell's government withdrawing the funding they had initially promised for the Station 20 West for that grocery store, we are back to not having a grocery store. Although there is one a bit further down where a liquor store used to be. Someone opened kind of a gentrifying new, it looks like a Whole Foods, and I have not yet been in there, and I'm a little afraid, but maybe I'll go when I go back to Saskatoon. So that's just like sort of the geography of where I'm from. I think of the work of Vanessa Watts very often when I'm thinking about what it means to be in relation to, what does it mean to be in relation in a city, and how the agency of Indigenous beings, both human and non, how we define agency, who has it and who defines it, plays a role in naming genocide. So Vanessa Watts, who's a Haudenosaunee scholar teaches at McMaster, writes, agency has erroneously become exclusive to humans through the devaluation of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing. The notion of human and kin interconnectedness is paralleled in Tasha Hubbard's research on the genocidal consequences of bison massacres as a key mechanism in the colonization and Canadian colonization of the prairies. How many of you are familiar with Tasha Hubbard's work? Her stuff is really important. And she doesn't get enough cred for it, so you should look her up. I'll be name dropping a lot during this talk. And these are all the folks that have educated me and continue to educate me. An honest accounting of indigenous genocide, which I think is important. It's important to use the term genocide because there's a lot of history books that don't want to go there. They don't want to say genocide. They might say cultural genocide, which is also true. But genocide, as in the physical elimination of bodies from a place, of life suspended and death imposed, must obliterate colonial borders of land and nature culture binaries to link violence done to non-human animals and more broadly conceived kin. That is, think of grass, not the itchy kind, like there's this grass, the green grass that grows lawns is not the kind of grass that I'm thinking of as kin, but it could be maybe. I'm allergic to it. Snow, rivers, oil, the animate. We talk about animate and inanimate a lot in Neheowewin. And there's another scholar I want you to know, Zoe Todd, who is at Carleton University in Ottawa, but who is currently she's on a visiting scholarship at Yale. And she does research on oil as kin. She asks, what are our responsibilities to oil, and how does our understanding of extractive industry and its consequences, like the oil spills on the rivers that go through our territories, change if we think of products like bitumen as animate or once animate creatures? Genocide is a process executable and excusable when settler colonialism has devalued certain lives, certain bodies belonging to certain lands to the point where death is not conceived as a state crime, or the benefit to the state is considered greater than the damage done to life, or more accurately, greater than the life to which damage is done. When most Canadians think of Saskatchewan, when they think of us at all, they think of violence. It's like a state of exceptional violence. There are a few of us who've talked about this: Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, Attawapiskat, Northern Ontario, Northern Saskatchewan, La Loche. There are places with a lot of Indigenous folks that are, and these are the places, not surprisingly, that are considered and propagated the idea of them as ruined and or dangerous. My neighborhood, Pleasant Hill, is the heart of the city, nestled between downtown and the suburbs. There's been a substantial and growing Indigenous population here since the 1970s. This is what my thesis is on at University of Toronto. I could start by reciting the recently released updated socioeconomic statistics of the area that position us firmly at the bottom of the city in terms of institutional educational achievement. There's very few of us that have even made it to university, let alone through grade school, let alone to high school. I could start by talking about the statistics on low income, low home ownership, low life expectancy, like how low our age expectancy is compared to the rest of the city even. Nearly every other facet of what it means to have our lives strangled by centuries of dispossession poured into one mostly Indian neighborhood. But there's been a lot of articles and chapters and books written lately about my neighborhood, about Regina's North End, about Winnipeg, about Attawapiskat. I'm sure there's there's terrible articles in Maclean's about La Loche in the north and North Saskatchewan. And these are all such beautiful communities. And these articles written always start with statistics. So we have to be just as deliberate in stating the things we choose not to mark or map. So I don't want to get up here and tell you all of the problems that we have, because that type of confession, that type of mapping, and me mapping out that space for you will only reiterate what I don't want to reiterate, which is like a damaged focus narrative. As Eve Tuck writes, the assumption in putting a statistic in your writing relies on the idea that there's an appropriate number of people that it should be happening to. underpinned by a carceral logic, as if the goal is to get less of something happening and not changing the discourse, world, and structure altogether. So instead of reading statistics, I'll tell you that Pleasant Hill is where I grew up and had the chance to learn Cree in school, Nahiawewen, and sit with elders as much as I sat with teachers, and that most of my teachers from preschool to grade 4 were Cree, Métis, and Dene women. I'll tell you that this is where I think of when I think of home and the place I want to end up in my life. That reserves in any inner city neighborhoods, not to conflate the experience, but to contextualize them as spatially and ontologically relatable, are not only places to be escaped from, but in fact, they serve as crucial holding grounds for our languages and cultures, as much as the opposite was intended. This is an example of one of the brown fields in my community it was owned by an oil company. There used to be a gas station there, and when they're done, like with the usage of it, and it's too contaminated to continue using it, they shut it down, and sometimes we'll put a fence around it or a barrier, but often just leave it like wide open. This has been wide open for as long as I can remember, with a sign on it. Saying like, don't walk over this ground. And there are a lot of places like that in the inner city, and it's right next to No Frills, or where Extra Foods used to be on 22nd Street. So I think frequently of the danger of young people growing up and playing in spaces like these, and sort of the environmental toxicity that we're exposed to against our will as low-income residents of this neighborhood, mostly indigenous. I also want to connect it to, I was on a panel, I got to go to Detroit and talk to some Black women there who were fighting against environmental racism in their community, and what they saw as anti-Blackness and the environmental violence of that. So many of them have there was a bunch of kids getting sick at one of their schools in Detroit, this particular section of Detroit. And so they, without telling anyone, they tested the ground for contamination, and it had like 80 times the acceptable amount of lead in the ground that it should have, and there was a playground there. So when I think of like Black and Indigenous solidarity, I think of how often environmental violence impacts us first and foremost, even in urban centers. 2 summers ago in Saskatchewan, we experienced a major Husky energy pipeline leak. It's filled 225,000 liters of bitumen and diluent into the Saskatchewan-Mississippi, the South Saskatchewan. This river, already one of the most at risk in Canada. We gathered on the banks of the river in downtown Saskatoon every day at 7 p.m. for a week, and sang and drummed to the river for its healing and for the deaths past and images of oil-soaked animals and birds flooding our eyes. These images weren't released or acknowledged by Husky or the government of Saskatchewan. They were taken by folks on reserve who disobeyed police orders to stay away from the banks of the river. The government of Saskatchewan and Husky Energy distributed photographs and videos of the oil catchers splayed along the sides of the river. I don't know if anyone got to see them. They were like sort of stacked down the river around the Battlefords. And this was the way of assuring rural Saskatchewan residents that the situation was under control. At the same time, there was a meeting held in the Battlefords, organized and attended by community members, to discuss the scope of the damage done and what could be done about it. A biologist from one of the communities brought samples of the bitumen and diluent scraped directly from the shore, and jars of water collected from the areas that the government had deemed to be safe just like a week earlier. 2 years later, remnants of the pipeline leak still remain. This is only one of hundreds of reported sites in Saskatchewan where spills have occurred and continue to occur daily. Most of them just aren't as spectacular. At the same time, along this river, we mourn the killing of Colton Bushy, a 22-year-old from Red Pheasant Cree Nation, killed on a farm for alleged trespassing. During the preliminary hearing in April 2017, Gerald Stanley's defense of the shooting was that Bushy and his friends posed a legitimate threat to the safety of Stanley's family, his farm and his property, so the shooting was justifiable as self-defense. Later, one tactic of the defense would be to claim, and I think this was sort of the case-winning defense of the trial, was the claim that the shots that ended up entering Colton's body in the back were caused by a hang fire, which is an absurd and scientifically super rare event where a gun magically fires when it's not supposed to. I want to think through the political implications of the hang fire defense. Guns are a symbol of progress, modernity, power. They're readily displayed in the Battlefields Museum. I'm sure lots of you have been there. They have guns there. They have even some Nazi paraphernalia that's still there. I don't know why. I do know why, but the discharge of the gun was therefore not an active action on the part of a shooter, Stanley, but the gun and bullet simply fulfilling its supposed technological end to eliminate indigenous people. In the transcript, the court views the extensive collection of guns, rifles, and pistols that Stanley owns and displays in his home. Of course, none of those arguments undoes the most basic reality, that Gerald Stanley left the farm alive and Colton Boushie did not. In a land that tried its best to eradicate indigenous people and our communities to make way for extraction and empire, our existence is always trespassing. The prairies is a space where indigenous existence, our lives, are hyper-visible, meaning, I forget what this is like in Toronto because it's a little different. So when I come home, I had actually an anxiety attack coming home this time on the plane, just remembering like in Toronto I can sort of blend in and be like ambiguous brown. And not face the same type of violence. This is not to say Toronto is not racist, because it absolutely is. Ontario is absolutely racist. And Black Lives Matter will, if you check out the Black Lives Matter hashtag on Twitter, and you'll see all of the cases that folks there are battling right now. But to come home to the prairies and think, like, this is supposed to be my home and I should feel safe here, realizing that I feel less and less safe. But it's just something that takes some getting used to, which I didn't have to. We shouldn't have to get used to that type of violence. But our movement especially, and folks have written on this for a long time, that moving through spaces as Nahiawak, as Anishinaabeg, is trespassing. One of the main ways that our livelihoods and our freedom have been restricted as Indigenous folks is restriction of our mobility and movement through, first, like state mechanisms, so policy, and secondly, normalized violence of state maintenance from settler populations. So yes, it's Canada and the RCMP and the cops and hunting, folks who do hunting control, hunting and gaming controls. But it's also sort of the everyday normalized violence that settlers are taught in school to uphold. From the pass system to restrictions on hunting, fishing, and trapping, to residential schooling, missing and murdered women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and queer people, and overwhelmingly disproportionate rates of incarceration, the explicit and implicit polity of Canada as a settler state, and this is true of like many settler states, any settler state, is the regulation of Indigenous movement. Many of you know about the pass system. This regulation is a gendered project as well, and so its interruption is necessarily feminist, even though we might not always use the word feminist. To reclaim Indigenous agency in a space where it's continuously denied from us, our feeling, the essential distinction between a living body and a dead one, is radical resistance. Feeling, when I say feeling, I mean something that's not bounded by the borders of our bodies, but overflows the edges of ourselves to create communities, nations, and sovereignty in the acts of mourning and in our acts of joy. In 2017, Brad Wall's Saskatchewan Party government became the only province in Canada to try to cut funding for funerals for people on social assistance and disability programs. I know this because I know that parts of this still went through because I have family members who are on disability, and I've watched as the amount of money that they're allotted, the amount of dignity that they're allotted has decreased under this government. While this effort, particularly the effort of eliminating funerals, was blocked and reversed, the government still succeeded in reducing the amount of funding allocated to social assistance recipients for funerals. As poor and colonized people, we're not allowed to rest, and we're rarely allowed time to mourn, let alone time to love. Where can we find time reserved specifically for feeling? It often comes in the form of mourning. Sitting with sadness and reflecting upon trauma, death, brownfields, and broken bodies. And the other thing is we don't think of death in a lot of cases in the same way as settler societies do, and there's been a couple of books written about this. I really like Sylvia McAdams-Sesayriam's book, Nationhood Interrupted, is another good book for you to read about that. But if we think about death in an Indigenous perspective, death that happens naturally or death that happens too soon, in either case, we have to claim responsibilities and accountabilities to ensure dignity in life and afterlife. As Eve Tuck cautions, we must avoid damage-centered research and the trapping of low-income, inner-city Indigenous bodies, lives, and lands within a space of irredeemable tragedy and therefore disposability. In suspending damage, one of my frameworks for prioritizing Indigenous desire, and this is the term that Eve Tuck uses, and it comes from, I believe, some old French philosophers, and I don't know if she uses it anymore, but it's still a useful framework. The idea of desire. What if we focused on desire rather than damage for Indigenous folks? So we must avoid damage-centered research and the trapping of any Indigenous people within a space of tragedy. So the piece I'm referring to specifically that I recommend you all read, because it's a very short and easy to read and beautiful little piece, is called Suspending Damage. She writes, "People have made their careers on telling stories of damage about me, about communities like mine. We know that we're not only trauma, we're not only oil spills and brownfields, but in taking time to mourn, we declare ourselves mournable. When I think of mourning, though, I don't think of helplessness, and I wish to disrupt common Canadian narratives that present Indigenous people as doomed, as always becoming extinct, as tragic. I think of mourning as one way we celebrate life. Our mourning and our feeling is exuberant excess, at once honoring and overflowing the vulnerabilities of our bodies." This is a piece of art that was done by, I can't remember this, and I know it. It's somewhere in my notes. I'll tell you when I remember. Dylan Miner, who is a Métis faculty member at Michigan State University. So mourning is important for us because Indigenous death is not named genocide. While taking the lives of Indigenous people on the prairies, Nehio, Dene, Métis, Soto, Dakota, are not considered a loss worthy of mourning or an illegal act. I remember being on a phone call when I had a picture of Tina Fontaine up just before this. I remember being on a phone call with Tennille Campbell, my bestie who drove me here, and how the verdict came down that Cormier got off basically for her death. And it was sort of a couple of weeks after we found out the verdict for Gerald Stanley, and that Gerald Stanley got acquitted of killing Colton Boushie. And we just had no more grief left in us. So we just sat on the phone and listened to each other and sort of tried to talk through it. But there's at a point, there's nothing you can say. Because every time you wish things will be different, and every time you think, maybe this time it'll be different. Of course I'm not gonna put my trust or my freedom or believe that Canada will ever set me free as an Indigenous person, will ever honor our lives as Indigenous people. Trudeau with his buckskin jacket or not, it doesn't matter. Or his headdresses, many headdresses. So yeah, I remember that day very clearly. And then, so when our deaths are like actually legalized, and Audra Simpson talks about this in her book Mohawk Interruptus, which is another citation. Audra Simpson, Mohawk Interruptus. Our deaths become a state-sanctioned event, and control of Indigenous death becomes a form of power. This has become clearer than ever as my communities at home are confronting the recent verdicts absolving both the murders of Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine. As far as the settler colonial state can see, dead bodies don't move or migrate or transgress or trespass. Gerald Visner, an Anishinaabe scholar, conceives of our presence itself, our just being here and just showing up. That showing up is half the battle, half the battle of sovereignty. Our presence itself is sovereignty. Today, he writes, treaties are a presence, the recurrence of transmotion, and intrinsic native sovereignty, sovereignty that can't be granted by a colonial government. So our sovereignty is not something that's allowed, granted, or given. It's something that is intrinsic to our existence here. In the very act of continuing to live while Indigenous, we embody treaties made and promises that must be kept, futures that have never fully vanished. I can't stand it when folks will come up and say, yeah, you lost everything. They lost their culture. It's like, they lost their culture is so common in first-year papers. The natives lost all their culture. And I hope you can see sort of like where, in that sentence, so much of terra nullius is upheld. So what happens when our bodies are missing? When our bodies go missing, when they're stolen, when they're killed? It's as if the treaty obligations then end there. There's no more treaties if there's no more Indians, and Russ Diabo has talked about this in his termination tables work with Idle No More. Akili Mbembe uses the term necropolitics. The best way to control Indigenous life is the destruction of our bodies. Again, I want to come back to some of the work that's being done in Black communities by Black scholars right now, particularly Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten are two of my favorite writers. And if you want, I can, I don't know, come up to me and I can write these down for you after, or just tell you. But in a conversation, they have a conversation on YouTube, Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten, and Fred says, anyone who thinks they can understand how terrible the terror has been without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of that terror is wrong. There's no calculus of the terror that can make a proper calculation without reference to that which resists it. It's just not possible. This is a teaching that comes back to me daily. Last August, just before I left to start grad school, or 2 August ago, just before I left to start grad school in Toronto, we gathered on Red Pheasant Cree Nation for the one-year feast to the memory of Colton. We sat on the floor on blankets spread out in a circle. Chairs were given to elders and those who needed them. There were journalists in attendance, only a couple. There's a couple, we need more, so if anyone wants to become a radical journalist and start talking to Native people, we would welcome that in our communities, I think. But there were a couple journalists there, and they were asked to put down their notepads and turn off their tape recorders and stuff to join the ceremony. And all of them were white folks and nervous about it, but still respected the wishes and ended up being a really powerful experience. So there was about 100 people in attendance, but there was so much food that we each took a few days' supply home with us. Beef stew, corn soup, a pack of gummy bears, cookies, grease. I remember 2 urban Indian women laughing that they'd never seen such an extravagant feast before. 3 different types of bannock. 4 cans of pop. In a world where Indigenous death is constant to the point of normalcy, feeding ourselves is a rebellious act. Here, nourishment is a visible act of care, and a declaration that mourning is a communal activity. This is the way we get through things, together. 2 bags of chips. A framed photo of Colton goes around the circle. The ceremonial leader, who's a Dene from Black Lake, way up north, asks us to sit with the photo in our hands. Let him know you miss him. Let him know how you feel. Feeling is the essential distinction between life and death. To set aside time to feel anything at all, even and especially perhaps sadness and rage sometimes, is to embrace mortality while casting out death. It's an act of embodied indigenous governance. It's a treaty. This is precisely why Frantz Fanon, another theorist you're like hopefully familiar with, his focus is not on the dehumanization of colonized peoples for the trauma we hold, but the inhumanity of colonizers who have let themselves become unfeeling, rendered zombies by colonialism. Where forgetting is one essential marker of a settler colony, Indigenous mourning is an anti-colonial act of simultaneous remembering and futuring. As Lee Maracle writes, when settlers tell us to forget the past, they're asking us to remain powerless. The existence of settler colonies like Canada relies upon selective memory and the erasure of Indigenous knowledges, histories, and genocides. The deliberate lack of accounting for terror done to Indigenous populations, for the settling and establishment of the state, to obtain and maintain control a land base and maintain control over resources and populations on the territory. As colonization and genocide are viewed in the past, the only visible wounds that remain, wounds that are visible to colonizers, to invoke Billy Ray Belcourt's work, are our bodies. Our mourning is a remembering of massacres with no documentation except oral stories, and our survival. These are some of the headlines from Maclean's. And I think it's I don't know what's going on at Maclean's. Obviously, they have, if you've been paying any attention to like Twitter or anything, like there's a lot of journalists who work at Maclean's. There's some decent ones for sure. It just is the case in all sort of colonial setups. There's some good police officers. There's some, I'm sure there were some good residential school teachers. There's some good folks who work at Maclean's, as well as the ones who continuously write articles about how Saskatchewan is like the crime capital of the world and how terrible all of these neighborhoods are. And when you read stuff like this, I want you to like critically analyze like where it's coming from and the fact that the communities that are named dangerous, that are named the worst neighborhoods, are consistently neighborhoods that are predominantly Indigenous and low income. So this is something that's really important to have media literacy. And I remember one of my teachers, Adam Gaudry at the University of Saskatchewan, he's at the University of Alberta now, a Métis scholar, had us go through some headlines and news stories. And he mixed them up. So some of them were from newspapers from like the 70s, and some were from newspapers in 2017. And sometimes you can't tell the difference because they keep regurgitating the same stories about damage in our communities. In the age of reconciliation, we're viewed only as wounds. And that too separates us from historical and ongoing resistance through trapping us in spectrality. This is a big thing in Indigenous studies right now. The idea of spectrality or being a ghost or haunting. The fact that maybe if maybe there is an afterlife and maybe that afterlife can have power. Mourning is an acknowledgement that we're wounded now not because we were wounded by something. That woundedness is not the inherent condition of simply being born Indigenous. While a spectral Indian is disruptive in its haunting, a ghost cannot take back the land. Or maybe it can, I'm not sure yet, I'm still thinking through it. As Judith Butler writes, the derealization of the other means that it is neither alive nor dead, but interminably spectral or ghost-like. In our mourning, in our joy, in the warmth of our living, feeling bodies, we enact sovereignty and treaties in motion. Here we create a continuing presence that disrupts the normality and presumed inevitability of our death on the prairies as an attempted justification of ongoing settler colonialism. Here we claim futures at the end of the world. Our mourning means we refuse to give up on the land. Fellow Neheo and Treaty 6 political scientist Emily Riddle, who's currently a grad student at UBC, tweets, As violent as the prairies has been to my family for hundreds of years, it's been our home for much longer. One of my first teachings as a kid who grew up in our homeland was that I belong here and no one can say otherwise. I don't dream of escaping or building a life elsewhere, rather making sure my fam can do that here where we belong. Our mourning means we refuse to give up on each other. Iskunikan, the land we didn't surrender. The other day I was in the U of T, University of Toronto Archives and Rare Book Library, and we're doing a project with the Indigenous Education Network there to create an Indigenous archive. Anyone who's familiar with sort of critical literature or scholarship around archives will know that Black and Indigenous folks have been sort of disrupting the idea of making archives for a long time. And I think Saidiya Hartman, again, is one of the people that needs to be cited there. I think, and I believe that this is like the largest university archive in Canada as well, or the land currently referred to as Canada. It was really beautiful and had the smell of old books. And I remember always feeling strange when I go into places like this, thinking like, oh, I want to read all these books, but probably half of them are terrible, probably more than half, and will just make me upset. And so I jokingly asked the archivist who was showing us around, where's the native section? Show me to the native section. And he told me, paraphrase, that's not how it works. As an archive, we keep a full account of objects and words within their context. So for example, all the newspaper clippings related to U of T from 1895 are kept in one file. There is an article from a U of T professor writing that he didn't believe that women should be allowed in the university, let alone Indians. This is supposed to be neutrality, the presumed unbiased, nonpartisan, apolitical method of documenting history. No politics involved there in what they kept. It's up to the researchers, they say, historians, political scientists, sociologists, to go through the archives, find what they need, and apply their own analysis to the material. The archive itself is only a collection. So like libraries are only collections, it's our job as folks in the humanities or social sciences to go in and interpret it, and sort of the idea that somehow the material that was saved in the first place had no political significance, like it was not political in the first place. So in the same way that archives aren't neutral, libraries aren't neutral, classrooms aren't neutral. In order to build an archive or a syllabus, in order to craft a classroom, knowledge must be defined. So what you're doing when you're creating a syllabus or creating a lesson plan, creating an archive, a reading list, what you're doing is deciding what are the material and words considered worthy of being considered knowledge. Literally you're determining what knowledge is for the students in your classroom, for the folks around you who will use your syllabi, and the material you save. So I think frequently about all of how carefully kept some of these books were. Sealed in like plastic, and the whole thing is temperature controlled, storage rooms, and it's kept there for decades. Some of these books, of course, have not been taken out of their plastic wrap for decades, but they're still kept in the archive and considered worthy of keeping. And the people doing the deciding, the naming of the knowledge, have rarely been Black, Indigenous, and colonized peoples. They're rarely queer people. They've rarely been women or femmes or Two-Spirit people. So while I felt excited to see all the books and papers preserved through the ages, I realized how the art, the writing, and the dreams of colonized peoples are rarely afforded this care. I was a philosophy student as an undergrad for some strange reason. And I think of Indigenous philosophers writing and teaching at the same time as Plato and Aristotle, even those writing right now, whose work is not considered worthy of saving. I wonder how different our lives might be today if we had found a way to save all the things and people that they burned, stole, and destroyed along the way. Because it's not just books and papers that are destroyed in the process of colonialism, it's the stories we hold in our bodies as well. In his poem, The Dream Keeper, Langston Hughes writes, "Bring me all of your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all of your heart melodies, that I might wrap them in a blue cloud cloth away from the too rough fingers of the world. Sometimes I'm afraid of writing, afraid of speaking, afraid of grad school. I'm afraid and angry of the constant police presence in my neighborhood. I think it was a mistake to come home and try to write my thesis on my neighborhood, in my neighborhood, because of the violence that seems so constant coming from the outside. And I'm afraid for the young folks that I know who are still being forced out of school in the province, and it's happening. The one statistic I will say, which is not an exact quote, but I'm sure many of you have seen it and are aware of it, is that nearly 100% of incarcerated youth in Saskatchewan are Indigenous. And I had a discussion with a professor the other day whose response to that was, so how do we do crime reduction? How do we help them commit less crimes? And I thought, maybe that's not the question we should be asking. Maybe the question we should be asking is, if 100% of people in a prison are all Indigenous, perhaps the goal of the prison is not what you think it is. Perhaps the goal of the prison is another way of constraining our movement. And I know there are Indigenous kids who are currently in Saskatchewan prisons for something as simple as weed possession. So as soon as we see the legalization of it coming up this week, that's something to keep in mind as well. How do you raise a Black or Indigenous child in a world where we're taught to be afraid of walking home? At the end of our meetings with my friends in the city, when we separate to walk or take transit, whether Toronto or Saskatoon, we say goodbye to each other. And usually I say something like, be safe, text me when you get home. There are so many things we're told we're supposed to do and be as Indigenous women to be safe. I can do this one actually. This is a photo of Marlene Bird and her partner before Marlene died as a result of her injuries. And there's a really beautiful interview written by her partner that's available that you can find if you Google Marlene Bird. And when I show pictures like this, I refuse to show pictures of Indigenous folks in pain, because that's all I saw growing up. I got to see Neil Stonechild on the ground with cops walking around him. And that's not what I'm interested in seeing anymore. And I see this too. A lot of Black folks have pointed out on Twitter and other platforms that sharing a video of a police shooting, an unarmed Black kid, or strangle holding a young Black girl, who does that help? Who does that type of trauma consumption actually help? Because it doesn't help the families. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help people to see us as more human. It just normalizes Indigenous pain. So I want to show you photos of people who are enjoying their lives. So yeah, even when I say be safe, we say be safe to each other. We say it more as of an invocation than a command. I hope you are safe, even though I know there's a good chance you won't be walking home. Where in this colonial state can we ever be safe? When and how? Do you understand that it's impossible in this context to exist as a Black or Indigenous trans person, a queer person, a woman or a girl or a femme in Canada without being considered at risk? I remember being in so many at-risk youth programs as a kid, and those were the programs that we were only programming available to us as young Indigenous kids in inner city Saskatoon. And now what I see happening in place of that, so as at-risk is sort of being phased out generally, I see reconciliation popping up in place of that. So reconciliation stuff for Indigenous youth, which means that Indigenous youth don't really get their own programming often unless it's in conjunction with you have to make friends with white kids. You have to be reconciling always, which is not fair. And Indigenous youth deserve their own programming as well. Spaces where they can exist and not have to explain yourself. I'm sure you all know this in some way or another, how it feels to be around someone you don't have to explain yourself to. And that's how I feel about the organizing and gathering work we've done, is that we can be together and talk about the shit, all the bad shit that has happened over the past 500 years and more recently, and not have to explain it, because it's hard to explain your humanity to someone, even if you're in grad school. It never gets any easier. Daring to exist here means we're at risk of colonial gender violence, and colonial violence to me is always gendered. That's the nature of the settler colonial state under which we live, and why calling for its abolition, not its reformation, but abolition, is a demand for survival. I love this picture. In all the indigenous communities I know, we're writers, but we're also memory keepers and storytellers. Our voices and bodies themselves are sites of knowledge kept, knowledge created, and knowledge to come. As scientist Stephen Jay Gould wrote in 1979, I'm somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. To that, I could add residential schools, the bombings at Al Fakura School, the Cypress Hills Massacre, the routine killings of Gaza, ignored and normalized by the Canadian media, the notion that our lives, our families, our love, and our poetry are not worthy of the same consideration as that of colonizers. Does anyone recognize this? So this is what's so funny about this, is that institutional memory is very short. And so a lot of folks, even in Saskatoon, have already forgotten about this, but I didn't. I think there's some other people in the audience who didn't. Toni Morrison writes, the very serious function of racism is a distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. So this is a picture of the former Bedford Road Redmond logo, which was the high school that I attended in Saskatoon. And I think it was around 2016. I must have been earlier than that, probably, I think 2014? Yeah. 2014, okay. So in 2014, when I had, long after I graduated from high school, I was in university, doing my bachelor's at U of S. This was still the logo of my high school. And I remember at the time, like when I was a student at the school, I was the only Indigenous student in the advanced program, which is not because I was the only Indigenous student that belonged there, but because I was the only Indigenous student allowed into that space. Sheila McLean, who was my teacher at that point, sort of just like nudged me in the direction, and she was like, hey, what do you think of this logo? And I was like, I never really thought about it. And then I started thinking about it more, and I thought, oh, this is supposed to be a depiction of an Indigenous person. This is supposed to be a depiction of me. And like I felt no connection to it. And then I wrote an article in the school newspaper, just sort of jokingly, like kind of satirical, like funny, thinking that I could break down some barriers by like being funny at the same time as saying we need to get rid of it. But all I got was backlash, and actually teachers, like hearing from teachers that teachers were talking about me as a student in the teacher's room. What do you call it? The staff room, the teacher room. And hearing that teachers who I had to take classes with were basically saying I was making something out of nothing, that I was a troublemaker. So the second that I stepped out of my role as like the one Native kid in the advanced program, oh, she's smart, she's okay, she's a good Indian, and said, hey, maybe this is kind of racist. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of research to show that these logos are harmful. And after that, thankfully I was in grade 12 when that happened, because I don't know if I would have been able to stay at the school any longer than I did. But I graduated, and a couple years later when I had taken Indigenous studies at University of Saskatchewan, started learning more the history of tropes and stereotypes of Indigenous people, I thought maybe it's time to like sort of start a campaign to change this. So we did. A couple of friends, including Justin Meeb, who is Métis, Alex Wilson, Dr. Alex Wilson, who teaches at the University of Saskatchewan, Sheila McLean, Andre Baer. We had a solid group of little group of organizers. And it started with the simplest thing. I made a Facebook post saying, maybe we shouldn't have this mascot in like 2013 or 14 or whenever it started. And this was, you know what? It was like, I think it was before Idle No More, actually. It was before Idle No More, so it would have been 2012, 2011. And this was actually something that led up to Idle No More as well. So we took on the mascot, and I've never, like even during Idle No More, and running the Facebook page during Idle No More, even during all of the like media appearances that I've made, I've never gotten so much hate and bullying as I did as a result of challenging this logo, this sports team logo. I had constant messages from like high school boys and like people's parents telling me I needed to kill myself and that I was wasting their time and making a big deal about nothing. And so I co-wrote an article just recently with Dr. Alex Wilson and Dr. Sheila McLean, and it's called The Whiteness of Redmond, where we talk about our experiences. There's this educators, and mine is a high school and undergrad student pushing back against the use of Indigenous sports team mascots. So I remember, one of the things I remember is going to Brit, and they stopped, we went to Brit, and we had signs, so we were gonna hold up signs. And it was freezing cold. I had gone to Brit before. I was actually a Redmond cheerleader in grade 9. I'm so glad I got over that. And then we went to Brit, the big basketball tournament, and the only two folks out of our group that made it in with their signs were Stefan and Andrea, who are both identify as like white settler allies who do a ton of work in our community, and I love them so much. Stefan runs like breakdancing classes for youth, and Andrea works at the Core Neighborhood Youth Co-op. And they had like cop cars, 4 cop cars sitting out front, and they had cops inside posted at every Redmond thing because they thought that we were going to try to rip them down or something. And so they ended up anyway just taking that picture. And then the next year at Brit, Andre Baer actually managed to get in. So an Indigenous person actually managed to get past the security at Brit and held up this sign that we made together. And Andre Baer is now an AFN, FSIN youth representative. Brilliant kid, brilliant young man. I don't know what happened. No, I don't want to make a phone call. I'm going to call Andre right now. No. Anyway, so yeah, that photo, and he held up the sign, "We are people, not mascots, change Redmond," and he got booed. A whole auditorium of people booing an Indigenous man for holding up this sign saying, "I don't like this representation that you're using that's supposed to be of us." I don't know. So anyway, that was a really powerful moment, and I'm glad, I'm thankful that the school board eventually voted to change the mascot. And I remember the violence that happened like so clearly, and we wrote about some of it in that article, The Whiteness of Redmond. But in other spaces it looked like, some of you might know Max Finday, who works with Canadian Roots Exchange. He was a good friend of mine and came into the principal's office at Bedford with me at one point to talk to him about why like the school could use this as an opportunity to change it to something more positive. And less stereotypical red-skinned mascot. And he was extremely patronizing to us. He said, you know, I've been like given blankets, I've been given headdresses, I've been given a name, sort of trying to use these markers of indigeneity against us as two Indigenous students to say that we had no claim to be upset, no reason to be upset. There's a picture I really want to show you, so I hope it comes back. But in the meantime, let me think. I often, depending on where I'm going to talk, I'll tailor my talk to like who I'm talking to. And I knew that it was going to be a bunch of teacher candidates. I don't even know if that's the correct terminology. Pre-service teachers. And how important it is. I've spoken to lots of education classrooms at the University of Saskatchewan, at the U of R before, and how much power you will have as teachers. And how the only reason I'm in grad school right now as an Indigenous student is because there were one or two teachers along the way at every intersection, at every different level, who helped me do things like suggested I go to high school. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have gone to high school. Or known how to fill out the form to apply to get into high school. Same thing with my undergrad, same thing with my grad school. And I have also taught the first year Indigenous student experience programs at the University of Saskatchewan, which means that I'm used to sitting in front of standing in front of a classroom of 30 students who are like around my age, who are doing social work, education, and health, all of which require mandatory Indigenous studies at University of Saskatchewan. And remember how often I'd be talking about something like mascots, or talking about something like focusing on stories that Indigenous folks tell about ourselves and honoring that knowledge. And how often I would see someone in the back like either roll their eyes or texting, rolling their eyes. And I'm not like an authoritative person usually, and I didn't feel like I had to be at that point, but I remember two girls in the back of one class, I'll never forget, and they spent almost every day just like talking back and forth. And so eventually I had to talk to them about it and said, you know, the stuff we're doing here in this Indigenous Studies 101 course might not seem exciting or important to you, but this is probably the only Indigenous education you're going to like have a chance to get right now that isn't like the blanket exercise, that isn't like going to a powwow. So I want you to critically engage, because actually as social workers, as education folks who are going into education, as healthcare workers, you're on the front lines of whether or not Indigenous people live or die. Like, this isn't a joke. This is a piece that I wrote with Angela Starrett. And she did the art. She's a Gitxsan artist from BC. And this is from a piece I wrote called 12,000 Moons. And it was published in Red Rising magazine, which is this beautiful zine of Indigenous writing that comes out of Winnipeg. And they actually just released a teacher's guide. So if you're interested in that, it's really easy to find online, Red Rising magazine. So I want to ask a question, finally, to those of you who have spent too much time on defense, on survival, and the exhaustion of pushing back against patriarchy and depression and racism, against poverty, xenophobia, and our shared struggles against Zionism and settler colonialism. What would you do with your life if you were free? Anishinaabe scholar John Burroughs writes, "We find freedom in the context of so much unfreedom as Indigenous people in Canada." What would you write and speak if you weren't afraid of the very real violences we face every day for naming racism? And if you're someone who considers yourself unconstrained by the suffocations of colonialism, racism, poverty, sexism, queerphobia, and ableism, what will you do in your classrooms, in administrative meetings, and each day as you move along in a school to allow people the freedom that has been taken from us? I say allow here rather than grant, because I have too often seen the trope of white saviorism used to justify paternalism. The idea that settlers need to guide indigenous folks because we're damaged, because we're traumatized, because we're doomed. This is a picture from the 1970s BC caravan for Indian children, an organizing movement, and I love this image because even though it was a sign made in the 70s, it's still something that's applicable today. Don't do damage-centered research. Do something that's based on desire. Do something that's based on freedom. Do something that's based on recognizing indigenous folks as fully competent, capable agents who have had systems of colonialism literally suffocating us, and still, that still do. I was on this episode of APTN in Focus, and they didn't tell us, which is kind of weird, but there ended up being a farmer who supported Gerald Stanley's so was in defense of and helped organize actually a Facebook page called Farmers with Firearms after Colton Bushey was shot to protect property. And they kept talking, he kept saying it's just all about property, it's just property. And every time I hear property, I think land. And every time I think of the land, I think of indigenous folks who have been here for a really long time. And I said, I wish I didn't have to talk about colonialism every day. And I think about this with other indigenous scholars and writers and poets, and how it would be so beautiful to be able to do what we want to do, and the same is true for Black folks and racialized folks and queer folks, if we weren't always defending our humanity, like Toni Morrison says. What would you do? And I just, tongue-in-cheek, not really, sort of, half, said, I wish I could just talk about sex and fry bread. And sort of the embodiment of that kind of work that I see is my friend Tennille Campbell's work, and she is in the back. You can spot her by her very bright Fenty highlight and the earrings. And Tennille's work is core to my thesis because what she's done is written a poetry book called Indian Love Poems, #Indian Love Poems. Who's heard of it? Okay, well, now you all have, so, and it's an award-winning book, although it gets lost sometimes, and because Canada still wants those stories of Indian trauma. They still want stories of damage and trauma and residential schools, which doesn't mean that when we talk about sex and love and desire, it's unpolitical. Because we're always intertwined with those legacies. We always carry that with us, but at the same time, we don't always feel it right at the tip of our tongues. So in her book, Indian Love Poems, she writes a series of small love poems, love and sex poems. Some are hilarious, some are romantic, sort of. I don't know if maybe that's not a word she might use, but they're all beautiful, and they're meant for Indigenous folks. So I encourage you to pick up a copy of Indian Love Poems, #Indian Love Poems. And I'm gonna end with one of her poems like I usually do. This one is in the introduction to the book. I want to believe it all starts somewhere. These legendary love stories, these matriarchs and patriarchs that have guided us all into being. All love starts somewhere. Let's start our love story tonight. Kinana Skamitin. Thank you.